Hi, welcome to season 9. We're in episode 5 of what we're calling art and science. And we're going deep into art, we're going deep into science, and then we're looking at some of the ways that they interact. So today we're going to add art to science. And I'm Mary Abazia, and with me, of course, is Tom Spitali and Sean Wellham. Tom, do you want to take this a bit further and talk about what that means, art into science?
Yeah, I think our reputation can be somewhat of being marketing scientists, because what we tend to do is bring some significant scientific process to marketing, and allow people to apply that process, in a very disciplined manner. But I think the three of us agree, having done this together for 20 years, that there's a significant amount of art that makes the strategic scientific marketer very, very successful. And so, as the three of us were kind of discussing this episode, we threw out, a couple of our famous tools, if you will, that require a bit of art to really kind of hone in ultimately on a specific strategy. They're things like our influence mapping process, our segmentation process, our positioning process. There's probably a little bit of art in all the tools, but we wanted to take some time and at least start on this episode to talk about how art plays into some of those tools, some of those really important strategic marketing processes, and see how far we get. Maybe this will be a couple episodes, who knows? So maybe I'll just throw one out there so that we don't have that awkward silence that we had last time on the last episode. Let's just start with the influence mapping. This process that we take our clients through of identifying all of the stakeholders in a given market, and not only who they are, but how powerful each of the stakeholders are in today's world, and how that power is shifting so that our clients can really make sure that they're prioritizing the right stakeholders, the emerging stakeholders in any given market. How do you guys experience art in the process of building a stakeholder map?
Yeah, I think to me the big difference, we talk about art and science, but really it's evidence versus intuition, isn't it? That's how I tend to think of it. Like if we have hard evidence or something that's testable, then it comes into what we term the science category. It's something that we can evaluate. Whereas when you get into things like influencer map, it's very much intuition, because there's no reliable way to measure influence, I would suggest. We all sort of know that this individual or this group of individuals or this entity has a huge influence over our market. And we can all agree that, but how we compare their influence with, say, another group, which we all agree has maybe less influence, but still has some in our market. Well, we can all sit around and say they're more influential than these guys, but there's no real measure. I mean, we use the size of the circle to represent the size of the influence. So we have a visual cue, but the actual dimensions aren't calibrated in a way that everyone would agree that's a 7.2. That influence is 7, and this one's a 6.3. We don't have that degree of granularity or measurement. So I always think of it as being you just sort of know, and that becomes the interpretation part of it. If you like, the artistic part, it's really judgmental. It's subjective to an extent. And I think with the influencer map, it's one of maybe the more subjective tools that we have. We can all agree, but we don't know why we agree. We agree through experience and through, I guess, that thing you might call common sense. Yeah, we all agree. It's obvious this person's a big influence in our market, but measuring it is quite tricky. So I think influencer map often starts as an artistic endeavor, from my perspective.
Yeah, it's funny. I look at it as actually almost opposite, maybe. In that the current state, you can get it real and right. In fact, we had a client that I think they spent about $500,000, and they got every influencer on the map. I mean, they did it data out. And so their map was very accurate, and but the problem was is it was so complicated that no one really could get insights from it. So I think, you're right, Sean. If you're just kind of sculpting fog, you're guessing a lot. But if you take any actions towards getting evidence and supporting it and saying, to the salespeople, to other customers, is this how you see this landscape? It gets very scientific very fast because you can start to measure that. Where the art for me kicks in is more when you get to the future state, because you can't validate. That's where you really are thinking kind of tangentially, well, these trends are happening, so that might happen to that stakeholder group. The government might get bigger, or the payers may get smaller. So that's how I see art and science in one of my favorite tools.
It's interesting. I like when we actually disagree, because it's real, isn't it? As opposed to us all just like spouting some sort of pre-agreed line. But I'm going to push back a little bit and say that what you measure with influence is consensus. You measure agreement amongst people. Now, we all know there's plenty of examples where people can all agree and be totally wrong at the same time, right? A collective view doesn't necessarily mean it's right. Look at recent election results around the world, where you could take a view of saying, why would people vote this way for this thing? It's not always guaranteed. So yes, you can use science to measure consensus and say, it's like an opinion poll. 42% of people with a confidence interval of 3% agree with this statement. That's measurable. What's not measurable is the actual influence. That's the bit to me which is intangible. We're measuring what people believe somebody's influence is. And that may still be a very good yardstick. I'm not saying it's not, but it's not measuring influence per se. It's measuring the consensus of people who believe that to be so. Because part of the art of influence is to find those people that actually do have influence, but they're sort of hidden away or they're missing. And the consensus will always agree, oh yeah, you got to talk to these guys. You got to talk to these people. But if you can find someone that quietly is influencing things, maybe from behind the scenes, that's the art of it, is digging out those the real influence, if you like, not just the consensus. Not saying consensus is not important. That's the only way you've got to really take the first stab at who's influencing this market. But I would argue it doesn't measure influence as much as measures people's agreement on who influence is. And I think they're subtly different.
Well, I think you're right, because we're talking about different subtleties. I think that the consensus, if you stay in your own four walls, that's where the consensus, everyone starts to feel good, but they actually, the emperor has no clothes kind of a thing. But what I'm suggesting is going out to customers, and they're going to be able to more clearly say, this is the person that got me to make a decision. That person had no influence on my decision. So if you are going to actually get beyond your four walls and beyond that consensus, that's where I do think that you are measuring it, where you're talking to customers about who impacts their decisions. That's where it starts to get real for me.
And I think on that, there's the classic argument that no one admits that they respond to advertising, right? No one says, why'd you buy an Apple phone? Oh, because of the ad. It was great. There's all these people dancing, and there was the black and the white, and it was fantastic. I bought it. That they will always they'll sort of do a retcon and say, like, well, it's because it's a much better system, or it fits me, or I like the apps, or it's transport, or they'll give you lots of reasons. They'll never say because I saw an ad. You say to doctors, why do you prescribe this? Is this your prescription history anything to do with the symposiums and the various events that you went to in the Bahamas? And they will say, no, of course not. I'm a professional. Yet, if you correlate the data of people that attend those events and their subsequent prescribing history, it goes up. But they would never admit that was an influence to them. You say to someone, you do a massive advert for Apple featuring a well-known celebrity, and the sales go up. You ask those people who were the new customers, it wasn't because of that ad, it was because of a rational reason. So there's a danger of asking people what their influences are, because influence it's very subtle, and people have their own version of reality and they don't admit to influence. So there's still a chance that people will give you a wrong steer. And that, again, is art. It's not science, because you're measuring opinion, and opinion isn't measurable in such a meaningful way. It's not data as such.
Yeah, but I agree. People will lie. They do lie. There's bias in that. But what you did touch on is measuring their behavior. So when you go to customers, it's fair to ask them, but it also is good to use, especially now, there's so much data available, to correlate their actions with what's out there. And you can start to bring science in so that it does start to, it is measurable.
Yeah, well, I agree with that.
But watch the biases.
I agree with that. I think if you have someone that, say you had a key opinion leader and somehow you persuaded them to say something positive about your particular product or service, and then as a consequence of those people making that statement, you see an uptick, a correlation, if you like, between the event and subsequent sales, then you've got good evidence. So post-event, I totally agree. You can measure influence after you've made the influence decision. We're going to have this person front our campaign, or we're going to have this person bring up the benefits of our product in a meeting. We're going to get engineering to come to the party and say, this is really good for us because it lowers our maintenance costs, or something like that. If you do that and subsequently measure, then you've got some science. And I think that's the challenge. It's that timeline, because if you're trying to measure influence before you decide what to do, you'll struggle. If you measure it afterwards, totally agree. You've got good evidence, because then you're measuring cause and effect, but you've actually got the effect, as opposed to measuring sort of cause and opinion, which is the challenge, which is why I still say that at least at the beginning, it's a very artistic, interpretive, subjective approach. But I think the point you hit is that like everything, truth will out. You measure consequence, you measure effect, and then you retrospectively look and pull apart what those correlating variables were.
I think that it is definitely, I mean, people love it because we bring science to influence mapping. In other words, we bring a process. When we talk about it, we overlay a process so people can make decisions. But I do think that it is one of our more artistic tools for a couple of reasons. One is when you add the aspect of how is power shifting, okay, that becomes even more kind of hard to wrap your arms around in a very quantitative manner. And to me, that is the most important part of the process, right? Because your competitors would probably draw a very similar influence map, current state influence map as you. You know, everybody's like kind of settled in to saying these are the important stakeholders. The real insight that comes from the influence map is to then predict where as Gretzky used to say, where's the puck going, not where is the puck now. I skate to where the puck is going. And so that is a considerable amount of projection that goes in there. And I think that when you introduce that amount of projection, it becomes really artistic. The thing that I think all three of us have said to people, I know I have lots at the end of the influence map, when we ask the question, how would you get this right? The answer isn't typically go to some research house and try to measure influence and emerging influence. It's cost prohibitive. As Mary, as you said, somebody once did it and they spent $500,000 on it and they still didn't really get it right. It's kind of very hard to kind of get the definitive answer here. That's what makes it, I think, about artistic, because what we say is this is right when you've gotten enough opinions, from inside, outside your organization about the industry that you can say, I think this has got to be pretty close. To me, that's artistic. You're looking at something and you're saying, not quite now. Now it's done. And so that's why I think it is one of our more artistic processes, but people love it because we bring science to it and allow them to visualize the shift in power in a way that's really powerful. And allows them to make good decisions. So
yeah, I think part of that process, I like what you said. Well, Sean said, going back a little bit more, Sean said that part of the process is finding those people that your competitors didn't put on the map, or looking at it in a different way. And that clearly has to be art. I mean, unless you're really good at getting data that gives you some insight that your competitors don't, it takes getting that odd voice in the room when you're trying to figure it out, and they go, hey, you guys are forgetting somebody really obvious. And we've seen it in so many of our work sessions where they, our joke is you forget the baby in baby formula, and or the patient in some things. So there is a definite art to getting that person that isn't on that chart, or whoever that influence body is, and making sure that you have people that are different minded in your room when you're working on this, so that you do get a lot of different perspectives.
And Mary, you got to share a story. I think, Mary, your scientific perspective of this is driven by an experience that I've heard you talk about a lot, a scientific experience when you were talking about, I think it's about a local hospital and why they buy certain MRI machines. You know what story I'm talking about? Where I'll share it because I could tell by your face you're not remembering. Where everybody thought that the MRI, or that it was some kind of a medical machine, was dependent upon the opinion
my
of
friend,
the specialist. Yeah, go
Dr.
ahead.
King.
Take it from there.
Sorry. Yeah, I was a little slow. COVID. Dr. King. Everyone at the at the hospital, everyone thought that that this doctor was the head of radiology, was the one that everyone made the decisions on. And when they went to validate and they asked who helps you make the decisions, and they said, first, what type of equipment are you buying at the hospital now? They said, well, we're buying Toshiba. And then following up and saying, well, why are you buying Toshiba? And says, oh, the purchasing guy's going out to lunch with the Toshiba rep. It was obvious that purchasing's influence was much bigger, and the head of radiology actually was much smaller than what anyone had thought. So that helped them right size their map.
And that could cause you to think, well, right, then if I go and I have enough, if I do a quantitative survey, and I could find all of that, and that's a very I could find how that's playing out at different hospitals. That experience is somewhat more of a scientific thing, but that just, again, going back to it, decision making is done differently in so many different ways, and in so many different situations. It's just almost cost prohibitive to say I can scientifically measure influence. If I ask enough people, it's just very difficult, even if you had, an unlimited budget to do it. And that's back to why I think it's an artistic tool.
I think it's also an important part of the message that don't expect to have, we talk about our methodologies as tools for thinking, because they're not necessarily tools for solving. It's not E equals MC squared. There's not a formula that explains something. Yeah. You're really trying to narrow those balance of probabilities. We talked about this before. What burden of proof do you set yourself? And what we're trying to say is, let's go through a methodical process, counsel widely, get lots of inputs and opinions, keep asking what if, keep asking who's missing. Keep asking, how do we know that this person doesn't have influence? Think about who has the power to say no. There's lots of prompts and ways of thinking, and we bring that all together in a lovely structured process. And the attempt is to make sure we don't miss somebody important. We do have a relative importance scale that's generally agreed upon, and then we act upon it. So it's methodical, but it's also very intuitive and very subjective. And then the important part, how we measure it. Of course, the other challenge of measuring anything is that multifactorial. You can't isolate a single variable. Was it because we started speaking to this person? Was it because of this event that we had? Was it this new advertising campaign that we had? Was it the new packaging? Was it the trade show we went to? Was it? There's so many factors. It's really hard. So you have to have that. And again, that's the ultimate art, isn't it? Is looking at all those moving parts, all those little levers you can push and pull, and saying, this seems to be working. And you might never know. You might never know exactly that was the perfect combination, because the thing that haunts most marketers is that counterfactual thinking. What if we'd done this differently? What if we had done that pricing with that promotion targeted at these people, as opposed to what we did? And you can go nuts doing that. You can end up saying, there's so many ways. You've always got to look at saying, are we achieving our broad goal moving forward, achieving what we want, market share, price recovery, penetration, whatever it is. And then always look to improve through experimentation. And that's how you look at the whole tools put together, because once you add more than one tool into the mix, it's very much there's a knack to it. It's not scientific, which is why some people can be really good marketers and some people can have the same tools and maybe not quite so good. There's a sort of X factor in there, isn't there? That's the ultimate.
Yeah.
I didn't know if I'm not going to introduce a second tool because I think we really probably are coming up on our time, and we found a lot to talk about with that influence map. But I think the final point that I would make about influence mapping is, Sean, you called it multifactorial, and it can seem like so overwhelming, and not just with the influencer map, but with a lot of these other, pieces of the strategic marketing process. The great thing about the science of tools is that overlays on this multifactorial process, so that at least you can take this really almost overwhelming set of inputs and get to some kind of an agreement on how you're going to move forward. Because the biggest mistake is to do nothing at all, or just to throw up your hands, or just keep doing things the same way that you've always done them because you think it's too complicated, we can't do it. And so that's why having a set of scientific tools always makes a lot of sense, because you can overlay them and you can make the best decision possible, and not get complacent or just give up, which is, hope is not a strategy.
It's showing you working out, isn't it? Did you used to get that instruction in the exams that you took at school, where you'd say you'd get some math problem, and then the instruction would always say, show your workings out. The idea being you could get the answer wrong, but if you went through some sort of methodical approach and you did the right thing, you could still earn points for that exam question, right? So that was a common instruction, is show your workings out. Yeah. And it's similar to this. If you've got a methodology that says, how did you arrive at this decision? Well, we took this and we took this and we made this decision and we made these assumptions and we had this that we'd verified through this research and blah, blah, blah. And you have a coherent backing to your action. Yes. And not only that, you have people behind you, because we know one of the factors of marketing is that concept that success has many parents and failure is an orphan. And the more people that contribute to that endeavor, whether it succeeds or fails to whatever degree, you can't ever look at it and say, why did you do this? And you were part of this. It also builds that support, because you want everyone to be behind it. You don't want people on your own side waiting for something to fail because of some internal political reasons, right? So it's another great way of aligning people to that vision, and like I say, show you're working out.
Yeah. And at a much higher level, it shows that as a manager, there's an art to managing all of that collectiveness.
Right.
So, which is not easy sometimes, especially when you have to do everything on Zoom.
Yeah, maybe the art and science of management, that would be a topic that would keep us going for a day or two talking about that, because you're absolutely right. It's the ultimate, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. We hope that out of all of this, we've thrown a lot up, and hopefully you've thought of a few things that might help you think through your business and apply some art and science. We have loads of podcasts available, a couple of them on this topic and many on many others, 8 other seasons. So anywhere you get your podcast, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.